Max Verstappen's Hungary qualifying disaster was not caused by one bad corner. His Red Bull was getting worse every single lap. He spun at the final turn, qualified 6th, and finished more than half a second behind Lando Norris on pole. Then Verstappen exploded over the radio, saying the car was completely broken aerodynamically, and calling the entire weekend a joke. But the spin was only the final warning. Across 3 consecutive sessions, the same deeper problem kept growing. First, the car felt as though the handbrake was on. Then the rear started locking under braking. By qualifying, the RB22 was progressively losing rear aerodynamic grip, until Verstappen could no longer trust what the car would do. And that creates a huge problem for Red Bull. Because Verstappen was not simply fighting oversteer. He was fighting a car that appeared to change beneath him, lap after lap, while the team still had no confirmed single component to blame. The anger on the radio shocked everyone. But what caused that anger could be far more damaging than the outburst itself. Subscribe to the channel. To understand why Verstappen lashed out so aggressively, you have to look beyond the spin itself. Because the spin was not the beginning of Red Bull's problem. It was the moment the problem became impossible to ignore. Before qualifying even started, Verstappen had already spent the entire Hungary weekend warning the team that something felt wrong with the car. In the first practice session, he said the Red Bull felt like it was being driven with the handbrake on. That description matters. A Formula One car is supposed to feel sharp, responsive, and immediate. The driver turns the steering wheel, and the car should react with precision. The rear should remain stable. The entire machine should feel connected. But Verstappen was describing a car that felt restricted. A car that did not want to move freely. A car that was fighting him before the serious laps had even begun. Then the problem became more dangerous. During the second practice session, Verstappen reported rear locking under braking. In simple terms, the back of the car was becoming unstable as he tried to slow down. Imagine running at full speed, then feeling the floor move beneath your feet the moment you try to stop. You may stay upright once. You may even save it twice. But you cannot build confidence when every braking zone feels slightly different. And that is the first major clue. Verstappen did not enter qualifying with a clean, predictable car. He entered qualifying after 2 sessions of warnings. The first warning was that the car felt held back. The second was that the rear was unstable under braking. Then, during qualifying, the problem evolved into something even more serious. The rear aerodynamic grip began to fade. Lap after lap. Run after run. The car started to oversteer more. That means the back of the car wanted to rotate farther than Verstappen intended when he turned into a corner. A small amount of oversteer can be managed. Sometimes, a driver even prefers a car that rotates quickly. But this was not a stable balance that Verstappen could learn. The behavior was getting worse. And this changes everything. A driver can adapt to a difficult car when the difficulty stays the same. He can change his braking point. He can turn in more gently. He can avoid the curbs. He can protect the rear tires. But what happens when the car changes every lap? What happens when a corner that felt manageable 5 minutes earlier suddenly becomes dangerous? That is the nightmare Verstappen was describing. He was not simply trying to drive around one weakness. He was trying to predict a car that was becoming less predictable every time he returned to the track. And in Formula One, prediction is everything. At those speeds, a driver cannot wait for the car to lose control and then decide what to do. By then, it is already too late. The driver must know what the car will do before it happens. He must know how much rear grip will be available. He must know whether the car will remain stable when the brakes are released. He must know whether the rear will follow the front cleanly through the corner. Verstappen was losing that certainty. And without certainty, confidence begins to collapse. That is why his radio message after the spin was so explosive. He said the car was completely broken aerodynamically. Then he said it was getting worse and worse. That second statement is the most important one. Because it tells us the problem was not limited to the final corner. It had been building throughout the session. The spin was only the final consequence. Think of it like walking across a frozen lake while the ice becomes thinner beneath every step. At first, you move carefully. Then you hear a crack. Then another. You know the surface is becoming less reliable, but you still have to keep moving forward. Eventually, one step is enough. Not because that step was dramatically different. Because the surface underneath it had already become too weak. That is what happened to Verstappen's confidence in the Red Bull. The final corner did not suddenly become impossible. The rear of the car had been moving closer to failure throughout qualifying. And Verstappen knew it. That explains why the anger came so quickly. This was not the frustration of a driver who had made one mistake. This was the frustration of a driver who believed the car had been warning the team for hours. He had already called it undrivable earlier in the weekend. Then, in the final part of qualifying, the warning became visible to everyone. The car rotated. The lap disappeared. The yellow flags came out. And Verstappen's position was locked into 6th. 1 minute, 17.725 seconds. More than half a second behind Lando Norris on pole. In qualifying terms, that gap is enormous. Especially for a driver who expects to fight at the front. But the number alone does not explain the disaster. The deeper problem is that Red Bull still did not have a confirmed single component to blame. The source confirms a progressive loss of rear aerodynamic performance. It does not identify one exact failed part. And that uncertainty creates a far bigger challenge for the team. A visible failure can be replaced. A broken piece can be removed. A damaged component can be examined. But when the car's aerodynamic balance slowly deteriorates through a session, the investigation becomes much harder. The team has to understand why the airflow changed. Why the rear lost support? Why the oversteer increased? Why the car became more difficult to control as qualifying continued? And until Red Bull answers those questions, Verstappen cannot know whether the problem has been contained. That is where the tension with Laurent Mekies becomes so important. After the spin, Mekies came onto the radio and told Verstappen that conditions were extremely difficult. He said the team understood what Verstappen was feeling. That response was designed to calm the situation. But Verstappen did not need reassurance. He needed the car to stop changing. And there is a major difference between those two things. Mekies could acknowledge the problem. He could recognize the frustration. He could tell Verstappen that the team understood. But none of those words could give Verstappen the rear grip he had just lost. That is why the exchange felt so tense. One side was trying to contain the emotion. The other side was trying to explain that the problem had already gone beyond normal frustration. Verstappen was not saying the setup was slightly wrong. He was saying the car was aerodynamically broken. That is an extraordinary accusation from inside the cockpit. Especially during qualifying. Especially when the championship situation is already difficult. Verstappen entered Hungary 7th in the drivers' standings with 91 points. He was already far away from the championship lead. Now he had qualified 6th, in a car he believed was becoming less stable with every lap. That means the spin was not only a qualifying setback. It threatened the entire weekend. And the danger did not stop with Verstappen. His spin triggered yellow flags at the final corner. Kimi Antonelli was directly behind him and became involved in an investigation over whether he had slowed enough in the affected area. George Russell also had to lift off the accelerator as he crossed the yellow flag zone. One Red Bull problem had now affected Mercedes as well. That is how quickly a qualifying incident spreads. The car loses rear grip. Verstappen spins. The yellow flags appear. Other drivers lose their laps. An investigation begins. And suddenly, Red Bull's internal problem becomes the entire paddock's problem. But for Verstappen, the biggest concern was still personal. He had to trust the car again. And trust cannot be restored through one radio message. It has to be rebuilt through behavior. The car must respond the same way twice. Then 3 times. Then over an entire run. Only then can a driver begin pushing toward the limit again. But Verstappen did not have time for a slow rebuilding process. Qualifying was ending. The race was approaching. And Red Bull needed answers immediately. Because starting 6th creates more traffic. More risk. More pressure on strategy. More time spent behind other cars. And if the rear aerodynamic loss returns during the race, Verstappen may have to manage a car that becomes harder to control over a much longer distance. That is the part Red Bull cannot afford to underestimate. A qualifying lap lasts a little over 1 minute. A race lasts far longer. If the car degraded aerodynamically during qualifying, what happens after repeated braking, repeated cornering, changing fuel load, and changing tire conditions? The source does not confirm that the same deterioration will continue during the race. But Red Bull cannot ignore the possibility. Because the warning signs were not isolated. They appeared across 3 consecutive sessions. First, the car felt restricted. Then, the rear became unstable under braking. Finally, the rear aerodynamic support faded enough to cause a spin. That progression makes the problem more alarming. Each session was not simply difficult. Each session appeared to reveal a more severe version of the same basic weakness. And that is why Verstappen's anger cannot be dismissed as emotion alone. His words were harsh. His frustration was obvious. But underneath the anger was a clear message. The car was becoming less controllable. The problem was growing. And Red Bull had not stopped it before the most important lap of qualifying. That is the real disaster. Not 6th place. Not the spin. Not even the radio outburst. The real disaster is that Verstappen entered the final corner without knowing whether the rear of his car would behave the way it had only moments earlier. And for a driver who builds his entire advantage on confidence, precision, and commitment, that uncertainty may be more damaging than any grid position. And this is where Red Bull's problem becomes much bigger than one angry radio message. Because Verstappen's frustration was not happening in isolation. It was happening inside a championship situation that was already turning against him. He entered the Hungary weekend 7th in the drivers' standings, with 91 points. That placed him behind both McLaren drivers, and far away from the lead. So every qualifying session mattered. Every starting position mattered. Every mistake carried more weight. And 6th place was not simply a disappointing result. It was another obstacle in a season where Verstappen could no longer afford to lose ground. That is why the final spin felt so damaging. He had one last opportunity to improve. One final lap. One final corner. And instead of finding more speed, he found the limit of a car he no longer trusted. But the biggest problem was not that the Red Bull lacked pace. The biggest problem was that Verstappen could not predict when the rear grip would disappear. A slow car can still be understood. A balanced car can still be managed. Even a difficult car can be driven around if the weakness remains consistent. But a car that changes during the session removes the driver's reference points. And without reference points, every corner becomes a calculation made with incomplete information. Verstappen would normally know exactly how hard he could attack the brakes. He would know how quickly he could turn. He would know how much throttle the rear tires could accept. But in Hungary, those answers appeared to change from one lap to the next. That is why his comment about the car degrading was so revealing. Normally, the tires lose performance. That is expected. The driver feels the grip falling away and adjusts.